So today we are going to be talking about the brachial plexus and nerve injuries, and I figured the best way to start this video off was by reviewing the brachial plexus because I always know I need a review, and sometimes drawing it out helps you remember it a little bit better. So I'll go ahead and get started by drawing the anterior roots of the brachial plexus. So we have C5, C6, C7, C8, and finally T1. These are the anterior roots, and they provide motor information, and we're just going to go ahead and draw the pathways of each of them. And we know that C5 and C6, they kind of connect. C7 is just on its own, and C8 and T1 also connect. And then there's also some other connections at different points in the brachial plexus. And we know that these connections kind of make this twisted way that the nerves kind of supply different muscles, and the different sections are the roots, which I already explained, the trunks, the divisions, the cords, and finally the terminal branches of the brachial plexus, which different nerves arise from. And I'm not going to get detailed into all of the ones that come off, like the lateral pectoral or the thoracic. We're not going to talk about those today. We're going to talk about mainly about the terminal branches. And so the way to remember this mnemonic is real Texans drink cold tea or cold beer, however you want to remember it. So that's the roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and terminal branches. And so now that we have that, I'm going to go ahead and kind of go through at least the way that each of these pathways run, at least so you have an idea. So we have the upper branch, the middle branch, and we have the lower branch. And so these nerves run around the subclavian artery, which turns into the axillary artery, which turns into the brachial artery. And so that is the anatomical position that it's referring to when we talk about upper, middle, lower, and then when we get further down to the cords. Here at the divisions, there are anterior branches and posterior branches, and I'm highlighting the anterior ones here in this light green color, and then the posterior ones here in this teal turquoise color. So that's just how the divisions go. It gets a little jumbled, but drawing it out definitely does help. So then as we go ahead and we move towards the cords, there's some other anatomical positions around the artery that we're going to talk about. So we have the lateral. At the top here, we have the posterior here in the middle with C7, and then we have the medial down here at the bottom. So that's the cords and their positioning. And then finally we have the terminal branches. And so the main ones, I just wanted to go ahead and side note, the axillary nerve does come off, and it is somewhat of a bigger one that supplies some arm muscles, so we'll go ahead and label that. But the terminal branches we usually talk about are musculocutaneous, the median nerve, the radial nerve, and finally the ulnar nerve. But for the sake of this nerve injury videos, we're really going to focus on the medial, the radial, and the ulnar nerve. Kind of what we talked about in class, but we'll just go on and expand upon that. So I'm now going to draw more of what happens as it goes down in the arm, kind of a 3D, if you will, instead of just a diagram of the brachial plexus. So getting down to it, I'm going to go ahead and draw some of the bony structures, the humerus, the acromion, the scapula, kind of connecting here at the top, and at the bottom I did draw the radius and the ulna, but I don't move it down until a second. And then I draw some muscles. We do just like a cross section of the biceps brachii, and its two connections, its two origins right here, just to kind of show the relationship between the nerves and the muscles as it goes down the arm, because that's important to the functions of the muscles. And so I guess while I'm going ahead and drawing that, I'll go ahead and explain. So the radial nerve, it travels behind the arm where the triceps is, and it comes around all the way down to the thumb, and it is responsible for the extensors and the supinator muscles in the upper extremity. The median nerve kind of comes down, just goes straight through your elbow all the way down to your hand as well, but it's responsible for the flexor and pronator muscles in the upper extremity, and then the ulnar nerve is responsible mainly for the intrinsics in the hand, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. The red that I'm drawing right now is what I talked about, the subclavian, which I really only show the axillary and the brachial artery going down, which we talked about in the brachial plexus and the relationship. So the yellow that I'm using right now is going to represent the different nerves. So you kind of see that M shape, which is also in the brachial plexus that I drew. And so you can see the musculocutaneous at the top, which goes into the coracobrachialis underneath biceps brachii. And it kind of does more of the superficial, I guess, muscles in the upper extremity. And so I also drew some other little branches of the musculocutaneous down there, as you can see. And then the other yellow I drew were the median and the ulnar, kind of on the medial side of the arm. And then on the lateral side, you see the radial nerve kind of coming out and going down. And then at the very bottom, you see the elbow where the artery bifurcates and the nerves are. So as we talk about the elbow, I think it's important to talk about cubital tunnel syndrome. And so this is a nerve entrapment. It's not necessarily a nerve injury. So this kind of happens when nerves are compressed, when they're stretched, when there's some kind of pressure on them, and it can cause a loss of motor function or a loss of sensation. So cubital tunnel syndrome can be caused by a trauma as well, or just mild pressure, and you can lose sensation in your small finger and the areas that the ulnar supplies. So I was just kind of explaining right now the M shape and the way that the nerves wind down, because it's important to wherever the nerves go and whatever muscles they supply, that's important for the sake of an injury, because that can help you tell maybe what nerve is injured. If you don't have sensation in a certain part of your hand and you know the ulnar nerve supplies the little finger and you're losing sensation, you know somewhere along the nerve is compressed or something. So cubital tunnel syndrome is when there's pressure in your elbow, your ulnar nerve kind of runs behind your elbow. So if you put your arms on a table for too long, it can cause that as well. And so as we talk about this, I really wanted to focus on nerve lesions. I just think it's interesting the way that the hand changes shape because of that. But before we get to that, I'll also go ahead and talk about, I didn't really picture it here, but also, so I talked about cubital tunnel syndrome, which is the ulnar nerve being compressed. But also there's carpal tunnel syndrome, which is in your wrist, and the median nerve is compressed. So that is similar. So I went ahead and I'm going to go ahead and draw these hands and explain more about which areas supply which area for sensation and motor function. So the P represents the palmar side and the D represents the dorsal side. So first I'm going to focus on the ulnar nerve and then we'll go from there. So with the ulnar nerve, we have sensation that goes to the little finger and half of the ring finger on the palmar side. And so I'm going to go ahead and shade that in so you can visually represent. And a good way to remember that is those two fingers together look like a U. So you can think of the ulnar nerve with that. I also kind of drew out just what the nerve would look like supplying that, and then going ahead and doing that also on the dorsal side, which is just the back half of, the dorsal side of the little and half of the ring finger. And so when you have a lesion to the ulnar nerve, you can get claw hand, and part of that is because the ulnar nerve supplies the flexor carpi ulnaris, the flexor digitorum profundus, flexor digiti minimi, and opponens digiti minimi. And so claw hand is when you have that ring finger and the small finger where they kind of start flexing into a claw. You don't have that opposition, and so the hand just kind of goes into that position. And it looks like that claw appearance. And yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about the median nerve now. And so I'm going to go ahead and draw that out on the palmar and the dorsal side. So a good way to remember the median nerve is, so it supplies the first two phalanges and half of the ring finger, as well as the thumb. And those three fingers together look like an M for median nerve, and so that's kind of how I remember that. And then on the dorsal side, they kind of just covered the tips, and then same thing, that half of the ring finger. And so when you have a lesion to the median nerve, you can either get an APAN or a sign of benediction, and the reason we can think about this is thinking about the muscles that the median nerve supplies, which is pronator teres, pronator quadratus, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum profundus, flexor digitorum superficialis, abductor pollicis brevis, flexor pollicis longus, flexor pollicis brevis, and opponens pollicis. And so an APAN is kind of like a full, more complete lesion, whereas the sign of benediction is just kind of those, just a few of them are affected. It's like an incomplete injury. That's kind of how I think of it. So now we're going to move on to the radial nerve. And so with the radial nerve, there's no clever way to remember it with the letter, but Dr. Bickley, our anatomy professor, taught us to remember radial nerve in C7 by thinking of a thumbs up, and that it's rad, so you're giving it a thumbs up, so radial nerve rad. So kind of on the palmar side, we have a part of the thumb, kind of the thenar muscles here, and then on the dorsal side, we have the parts that the median nerve basically didn't cover. So it supplies the triceps, brachioradialis, supinator, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum, extensor digitorum minimi, and extensor indices, as well as abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and extensor pollicis longus. And so when we have an injury to the radial nerve, we can see a wrist drop. Usually when you have a wrist drop, it's a high radial nerve injury, and it occurs usually with humeral fractions when the nerve spirals around the humerus, and we know that this is because in the wrist we have absent, I guess, wrist and digital extensors, and so the wrist just kind of drops down, flops down. And so honestly, the more that I draw it out and the more that I think about where the nerves run from the brachial plexus down the arm and into the hand, and which areas they supply, the more easily I can think about what injury and stuff is present based on what nerve and what muscles they supply. And you have to remember that not every nerve injury is the same. Sometimes it's partial, sometimes it's complete, depending on how severe it is. And also sometimes it's only motor, sometimes it's sensation, sometimes it's a both. There's no cookie cutter way to it, but the more that we know what the dermatomes are and what muscles are affected, the easier it is for us as occupational therapists to help that person and maybe what kind of splint they need or whatever moving forward as intervention.